And welcome everyone to our weekly call. Good to have you on. I'll just quickly pop up my slides as always for a moment. Just give me a second because I forgot to put them into the right display mode. Right, now let me put up my slides and share them. So yeah, they should have appeared on your screens, I hope. As I say, welcome to our weekly call. It's the beginning of March already. I don't know how that happened, but there you are. Our call, as always, kindly sponsored by DNS OARC, the Operations Analysis and DNS Operations Analysis and Research Centre. So thank you to the OARC team for their support of the call. Plan for the call this week, I've just tweaked the presentation title to make it consistent with Mark's slide, but I'll hand over in a second to Mark Robertshaw, the COO of the DNS Research Federation. Some of you would have met Mark previously, either on this call or indeed, since I mentioned OARC, I think I've been to some of the recent OARC meetings, Mark, in Charlotte, if I remember rightly. I'm pretty sure we spent some time in the airport lounge on the way back, all of a year ago. But anyway, Mark is going to be talking about measuring internet abuse by IP address. We shall have plenty of time for a discussion on that as required, and then as always we'll sort of pick up on some of the sort of recent developments in the news, think about some of the forthcoming events, etc. I will try and make time at the end in case anyone's got anything else that you want to bring up on the call, any of your own developments or news you want to share as well. So think about that, have that prepared if you've got anything. But without further ado then, I will stop sharing my slides. Welcome, Mark. Good to have you back on again. Over to you for your presentation. I'm looking forward to it.
Great, thank you very much, Andrew. And it is great indeed to be with you again. I haven't been with you for a while now, but it's great to be back presenting. As Andrew's mentioned, we're going to be looking today at a study we've completed on measuring internet abuse through IP addresses. There we go. Yeah, as Andrew's mentioned, I'm the COO for the DNS Research Federation. For those that haven't come across us before, we're a not-for-profit entity based in the UK with our mission to advance the understanding of DNS generally and in particular its impact on cybersecurity policy and technical standards. And we do that in broadly three ways: through education and research, access to data, and engagement technical standards. And actually today what we're looking at is a project which was actually funded by ARIN to raise awareness of the issues of IP address-based abuse. And this project, so that's, I suppose, as opposed to abuse which is transmitted through the use of domain names or host names or URLs. This is very much IP-based abuse. And the idea behind this project is to develop some indicators about how numbering resources are being misused in both phishing and malware attacks. So I hope that gives us a backdrop to what we've been doing for this study. Okay, so in terms of the questions we're seeking to answer through this study, it's really quite simply which percentage of reported malware URLs rely on IP addresses for distribution as opposed to relying upon domain names and other DNS indicators, and what percentage of reported phishing URLs equally rely upon IP addresses rather than sort of domain names, and likewise what's the geographical distribution of those IP addresses, and looking very much at the regional spread, both by logical RIR and also by country as well, to give a sense of how that abuse is being distributed across the world as well. So those are our kind of key questions for the study. Okay, so in terms of methodology, we get our reports from a variety of sources. You can see the ones here that we're using typically for phishing, and we use these key feeds for looking at the reports that have come in. OpenFish, APWG, MalWare and URL abuse are our key phishing feeds. And for malware, we have URL House, which is a fairly open source of malware data. Again, Malware Patrol, which is a commercial provider, as well as URL Abuse, which is another sort of um, open feed of malware data. So this is all based on reports that are reported to sort of third party um, sort of feed providers for the data here. In terms of what we do with the data, for all the data we get, we receive, we go through a process of enrichment. And for IP-based data, typically will receive the data as URLs. Now, there'll be URLs with directly referencing an IP address here rather than referencing a domain name. We will then deduplicate those daily to sort of ensure that we don't multiple count within the same chronological scope. And then we provide some enrichment on those reports to look up various key metrics that are important for the purposes of actually doing the analysis that we need here. So the key thing being that we do some deduplication at this point from our data. In terms of how we then get to geographical indication, which is one of the key parts of this, we look at BGP data, which we gather from the open source root views project, which we ingest daily, to look at the actual ASN, which is originating the prefix for a given IP address that we identify for abuse. And from there, we're able to correlate the source ASN with using RIR stats data, which is made available publicly from the RIRs, to determine the delegated country which the ASN is operating from. So that gives us sort of methodology for how we end up with effectively a sort of locational data from an IP address based reports coming into our platform. So moving on to the indicators that we and sort of I guess the results of this study, having looked at the methodology. First of all, it's worth setting the scene here that we've mentioned malware and phishing reports, and this gives you a sense of the total number of malware reports that we're seeing over the last sort of 12 months or so. And you can see that in terms of malware and phishing, both of them have a sort of fairly seasonal pattern here. So it's not consistent throughout the year. And definitely in terms of malware, there are very definite sort of events at different types of year and different sort of trends going on. But overall, on average, we see approximately 57,000 sort of malware reports and about 87,000 phishing reports. And this is the total number of reports that we see, including domain name reports and IP address reports. But it gives you a sense for the quantity of data that we're currently analyzing from the feeds that we mentioned earlier on in the presentation. And then going forward and starting to look at the actual percentage of reports that we see for malware to start with, which actually use IP addresses. As you can see, it's the majority, and that's, I guess, to be expected in many ways because malware doesn't typically require the use of a consumer, for example, clicking a link. It can be very much machine-to-machine transmitted. As many of you will be aware, there isn't a need for a domain name, and often people will just use IP addresses more readily for malware. So over the last 30 days, we've seen that 87.5% of our reports typically are using IP addresses as a means of purporting the malware abuse. And you can see that over the last year or so, look at tracking those rates. We've seen a sort of general incline. If anything, even more reports are being reported as using IP addresses. So the trend is generally upwards in terms of the percentage of reports that we're seeing that are being transmitted by IP addresses in the malware space. Looking at the phishing space, and again, this is very conceptually obvious when you think about it, it's the complete opposite. And as you can see, a very, very small percentage of reported phishing URLs are using IP addresses. And that fits with our sort of intuition that phishing is generally a consumer-driven exercise where they'll be typically clicking a link, and therefore you would want to use a domain name or a subdomain to sort of provide the consumer with something that would then encourage them to click the link as opposed to using IP addresses. But a fairly small percentage of those we still do see using IP addresses. And that's often we'll see that coupled with maybe some sort of string as a kind of like subpath of a URL, for example, to do that. But basically the pattern is very different for phishing than it is for malware, which I think sort of fits with our sort of conceptual understanding there. Again, very small percentages here, but even as you might expect, we're seeing a decline because the majority of phishing you'd expect to be very much driven by the use of friendly identifiers and DNS identifiers in that way. So moving on to the geographical view of this, this now looks at all the data we've got for both phishing and malware, mostly malware, given us the numbers we're looking at here, and gives you a sort of breakdown of the of how this is being split across the world based on sort of regions defined by the RIRs, of which we have the five RIRs that you see here: AP-NIC, RIPE NCC, ARIN, LACNIC, and AFRINIC. You can see that the vast majority of reports are coming out of the AP-NIC region, which I suppose is not unexpected. And when you look at the geographical view by country, you can see that the reports are dominated by China and India, which obviously the largest countries in the world, but also those that are purporting and are actually facilitating the most malware abuse, particularly in across the world as a whole picture. And then if we look sort of region by region, we can start to look at the different ones. So looking at LACNIC first of all, I guess this is fairly to be expected. You know, Brazil being one of the larger countries in the region, being responsible for most of the abuse in the LACNIC region, with other countries around there. Looking at the ARIN region in detail, again, maybe not unsurprising, the US being a dominant country there, and being responsible for most of the abuse in the ARIN region coming through. Looking at AFRINIC, those of you that will be familiar with the backdrop of recent developments in AFRINIC may not be surprised to find the domination of reports purported through the Seychelles. Apart from that, the other countries you would see there, South Africa coming through, Mauritius, and other countries coming through as being sort of subsidiary to that. Probably the most interesting regional pattern that we spotted was actually Europe, which has the least dominance. I mean, Russia obviously is dominating to some extent, but actually there's more of an equal spread across the sort of European market, with actually the other category being the most dominant in communicating the more of a sense of equal spread of abuse than perhaps in other regions as well. And finally, the AP-NIC focus, again, very much dominated by India and China in terms of as expected there, in terms of the abuse spreads, in terms of the geography there. And I think just really in summary, to summarize where the report here, obviously, we can see that malware IP address abuse is significant in terms of the stats that we're seeing. It accounts for the majority of the malware abuse that we see is being transmitted by IP addresses, and those percentages are on the rise as well. So we're seeing even more of our malware as a percentage being purported by IP address. As we mentioned, the AP region accounts for the majority of reported IP-based abuse. And really, just to end with a bit of a sort of open question, I suppose, very much the methodology we've gone for here is looking at sort of totals based upon countries, and whether perhaps there's an argument for looking as an extension at more sort of ratio-driven metrics, perhaps looking at the size of countries and looking at the percentage, as opposed to just looking at the overall numbers, might be a better way to reduce the bias in some of the results that we've got there. But I hope that's been interesting as a sort of summary of the breakdown of abuse, both from malware and phishing, but also how that has kind of like how that spreads out across the globe in terms of both by region and by country. So thank you very much. I'll be very happy to take any questions on that.
Fantastic. Thank you for that run through, Mark. I'm going to ask you probably a couple of potentially obvious and possibly silly questions. Then I'll pick up some more informed questions from the chat, and then open up to see if anybody else has got any others on the back of that. But firstly, you surprised me with your observations about the malware, because I would have thought simplistically that it would potentially burn IP addresses if it's sort of hard coded in the malware, as opposed to giving a URL which you can then change to another randomly generated URL in seconds, in the code as required. So to give you more of a flexibility point for delivery. So it'd be useful just to get your thoughts on that. And also, and I think this probably replicates one of the questions in the chat, in terms of IP addresses, are we talking about IPv4 or 6 or a blend of both, or what have you seen there? So we try those, and then I'll go systematically through the ones in the chat and then see if anybody else has got anything else on the back of those.
Yeah, I can take both those questions. So it is interesting. I agree with you, Andrew. And actually, the reports that we see from our third parties are these are typically confirmed reports that have come from people that have been obviously been attacked with malware, whatever. But they are very literally in the format of IP addresses, and that's where we're seeing the majority of the reports coming in. So I agree with you from a sort of flexibility point of view, from a sort of best practice coding point of view, it would be. But I guess
Best
there's
practice for
also
malware, which is an interesting concept. But yes, sorry, go on.
but I guess there's also the economics of that in that, if you don't need to actually register domain names, why would you bother? If you don't need to actually for something to do anything interactively in that way. So perhaps that's more the logic behind this. In terms of your second question, the vast majority of our data is IPv4 data. So there's very little IPv6 data in the feeds that we receive at the moment. So I think that it wasn't actually worth pulling out the IPv6 data in that way. So I should have probably made that clear in the presentation, but it's largely IPv4.
Okay, right, let's step through these questions. As I said, we'll do them from top to bottom, and then we'll see if anyone else has got anything else. So Michael's questions first. Question about the pre-duplicated results. Are some reporters more diverse than others? So I think this was one of your slides, I think, towards the front of the presentation, if I remember rightly.
Yes, do you mean in terms of do we see could you clarify that question actually, Michael, in terms of what you meant by the be more diverse?
Does this work?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what I was curious about is, so for instance, let's say you had 10 sources and they all report IP address A. Okay. So you deduplicate, that's one report. But maybe source number 8 gives you, 12 different IP addresses, but source 1, keeps repeating, oh, it's malware from, 1.1.2, right? So in other words, are some reporters more valuable because they report a diversity of sources, whereas others are just repeating what others essentially already noticed?
I think that's a really good question. Actually, what we find generally in our data sets is there isn't actually very much overlap at all. I mean, you're right, there are certain providers, and I'm thinking more about probably the domain name reporting that we see more than the IP address reporting. But there are some providers where we do see an awful lot of reports, for example, the same domain name or the same URL with slight variations on a theme and lots of repeats, and in a way that's sort of lots of noise. I think in the IP space we see less of that, but actually what's interesting is there's less overlap between providers. We see it's quite unusual to get there's not much deduplication required here, but it's something that we put in place to make sure that we don't double count what's effectively we believe to be the same report within the same time period.
But you're getting 80,000 reports and you're seeing 10,000 unique, so there's got to be an 8-to-1 ratio somewhere there, right?
That's right, absolutely. In terms of there is deduplication that will be often within the provider within sort of the scope we're looking at. So there is deduplication involved, but I suppose I was referring more to the deduplication across multiple providers. If that makes sense. We very rarely get the same reports from two different providers on the same day, so deduplication is less useful. I think what may have not been as clear in my explanation was that we're actually looking, I believe, at the total number of IP addresses we've got the average per month, which is fine. I think when we come to actually do the stats, we are then looking at unique IP addresses that we've seen over the period. So that does deduplicate over a much bigger period than we would be in terms of the monthly stats, if that makes sense.
Okay, Michael will jump back in if he wants further clarification. But second question on that, what's the year-to-year comparison? So I think you would have, again, one of your early slides
showed a pattern.
Yeah.
Is that a general question about the spread of malware over the years? Based on my first slide, I think it probably is. We broadly speaking, it's a fairly similar pattern going back in time, and you do see these different sort of interesting spikes throughout the year, and there seems to be definite seasonal patterns around. I mean, I guess conceptually with phishing, you could more clearly point to, times of year where that would be more of a problem, such as around sort of Christmas time, for example, where you've got lots of consumer activity. And you could point on other times of the year where it's obviously a Black Friday, where you can see there's good opportunities for doing coordinated phishing attacks around seasonal opportunity. I think with malware it's slightly different actually. We've probably, I mean, we haven't done a lot of extra correlation here, and it's something that would be interesting to do as a follow-up. But it's certainly clear that there are sort of malware sort of campaigns that take place at different times, and there's very definite sort of points which you can see in those charts, which would point to sort of times where people are doing coordinated attacks, and there's less of a I guess less of a repeatable pattern as there would be with phishing in terms of the obvious points of time in the year, but there is still the sort of average stats stay roughly the same, but actually you get these spikes where we believe there to be sort of coordinated attacks, if that makes sense.
Again, Michael can jump back in if he's got a follow-up. You've partially answered this next one. What about unique/24 and how much IPv6? So you've definitely covered at least part of that.
Yes, so all of our calculations is based on unique IP address as opposed to looking at the prefixes and the CIDRs in that way. So I mean, we could obviously extract the research up the level and say, well, actually, let's look at the prefixes, and that might be an interesting thing to do. I haven't got the comparative stats to hand about how that affects the numbers at this level, because we've counted more at the IP level, but I'll take that one away and see if I can get back to you with an answer about how that changes the stats.
Okay, and you've already said there's not much in the way of IPv6.
Very little IPv6 in the data we get at the moment. And that's purely the limitation of the reporting that we have.
Okay, so that might not be reflective of where this is happening, but just the information feeds that you've got thus far.
Exactly.
Possibly. Yeah. Okay, I'm not sure, this is probably my ignorance, but I'll read this one out, I don't quite understand it. So 350 CDN versus 3,500 US, 1 to 10 difference is usual.
Can you expand on that one, Michael?
It wasn't really a question. I was just noting that whenever there's comparisons between Canada and the United States, people note that United States is 10 times larger than Canada. So if you see that ratio 1 to 10 between Canada and the US, that means that percentage-wise, it's probably equal.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you for that one. I appreciate that. And my sort of final point at the end, my question was, one thing we'd like to do is to do more normalization on the data to give more of a sense of ratios based on country size as well as just the absolute stats, because I completely agree with you. Probably we'd see a different picture evolve if we normalized it for the size of country.
Okay, next one was Jim's. For the malware, do you know if it resolves a domain name first and then tries to use an HTTPS connection via an IP in a URL, or are the IPs hard-coded malware or delivered via DNS C2 before a connection?
That's a question I'm afraid I probably can't give you the answer to, because by the time we see the data from the feed providers that we're using for this analysis, it's already in composed URL formats.
Yeah, okay.
But my assumption is that these have been reported in the format that at the very least has been spotted by the person who's detected the malware. So you're right, it could be either way, is a simple answer. But because we also do get reports that are domain name based, albeit a smaller number, the assumption would be that typically that these are reports that have come in where people have used domain names. That's been our assumption here. So used IP addresses directly, as opposed to, as you say, doing a resolution.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how the IPs are derived from the malware itself, because a lot will depend on the telemetry, so where all this is observed from. You know, for instance, if it was picked up in a proxy, then you wouldn't necessarily know what was behind that, how that IP was derived, etc. So I think it would be informative to talk with the providers of the data and find out how it is derived. Because it would strike me that would have been likely to be hard coded in a malware binary itself, but there might be a configuration file that goes with it that changes all the time, or it's updated by another bit of malware that derives the IPs from somewhere else. So although the actual communication is by IP, it may be in fact just getting that data from somewhere else. Yeah.
Agreed. Yeah, thank you for that.
All right, thanks.
Okay. Question from other Michael. Is any of the DNS RF team going to attend ICANN 82 in Seattle? Was it from this coming weekend onwards, I guess? Maybe I'll broaden that. If anyone else on the call is going to Seattle, by all means pop, or even joining remotely, perhaps pop that in the chat as well. But Mark, do you know if you or any of your colleagues are heading off to the ICANN meeting?
So unfortunately, nobody's going in person this time, but largely because it's Seattle. But we are. I'm making one remote presentation, and we've got another presentation which we're doing sort of remotely during the conference. So yes, apologies, we're not going to be there in person this time.
Yeah, I think you've done the last couple. I mean, at least someone in the team has. Maybe you could pop the details of that presentation in the chat if you have a moment, Mark, at some point. If you want, or ping it to me afterwards, and I'll happily share it if you don't have it to hand. Okay. India malware against GIO customers ought to be V6. Is a comment rather than a question. So duly noted, Michael.
Geo is IPv6 only now. You know, there's several 100 million in India that are V6 only. So you want to attack them,
you have to.
Probably ought to use V6, right?
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, good point. Maybe V6 addresses in the short term might be a good defense against these types of attacks, but with the caveat that Mark doesn't have the data necessarily to know that for sure. Just the data he has doesn't have much V6.
Mark, is part of your point of talking at ICANN about some kind of call to action? Since you have data, you must have a most abuse /24. It'd be nice if somebody had a job of going and cleaning that up. Every month they clean up a new /24 or something. I don't know. That would be an interesting process to build on for ICANN to build on your data, since ultimately they're responsible for the V6, the address space, right?
I completely agree with you, and actually, I mean, I'm afraid my presentation in ICANN is on a very completely different topic to this, so I won't be presenting this piece of work in ICANN. But what I will say is that one of the things that we're engaged with at the moment is producing sort of sets of league tables. I know that my colleagues have presented to you recently on this topic. And one of the league tables we're interested in is kind of ASN and prefix league tables, where we actually report on the amount of abuse that we're seeing and percentage of abuse that we're seeing underneath the sort of various ASs and also prefix. So I think that probably is the answer I'll give you in terms of what we're doing with that. And whilst we're not directly involved in necessarily taking action, we want to make that data available and also call out those networks which particularly are purporting the most abuse under their slash networks. And that kind of leads into the question that's come around about consider classification by cloud hosting and CDNs. And I agree, it would be good to do some work to either remove or to classify, certainly subclassify some of the work we've done here by the big cloud providers, Cloudflare, etc. And also, I think also to sort of call out how much of the abuse we're seeing is falling under those sort of classic proxy services which we see, because I think that's a problem. And also, it clouds the problem as well. And there's a kind of like a sort of I think, an industry call to try and understand who's actually behind those services, and that's something which is an ongoing challenge for all of us to effectively understand. But thank you for that as well.
Okay, so the final one then, as you've covered that, the question I think there from Eric is, and this is a statement and a question I think, or maybe two statements possibly. So V6 is likely NAT44 and may represent many hundreds of desktop PCs compromised, whereas V6 might represent unique PCs. There's one observation from Michael Richardson, that is, and then separately, Canada is ridiculously rich per capita in IPv4, and our dominant duopoly really hates V6. So unlike Gio, for example, you're only going to find V4 on those two networks, which fair point. So I'm not sure that really needs a response, Mark, although respond if you wish. I feel like comments more than questions though.
Yeah, and I think that just in general, that's one of the problems we've got in terms of reporting too much on V6 at the moment, is there's such a geographical bias as to which countries are adopting it reliably. I mean, I know that in the UK we've got really very, very bad adoption of V6 so far, comparatively, and we're still very IPv4 happy in this country as well. So it just presents a challenge, I think. So thank you for that comment.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So David snuck in with a not surprised at the trend of C2 using IPs only, not discovered via DNS, which I can't help but use as an opportunity to promote don't talk to strangers or the sort of Adam Network's zero trust DNS approach to default deny. Yeah, quite right. There are ways to defend against these types of attacks with zero trust approaches. Other vendors may be available as well. I should probably say for balance. But yeah, good comment, David. Right, last chance if anyone else wants to come in with any comments or questions, either pop them in the chat or feel free to unmute and speak if that's easier, depending on your location. I'm not seeing anyone typing and no one's talking. Last couple of seconds. Otherwise, I take that as a wrap then. Mark, thank you for doing that. That was much appreciated, really interesting. As ever with research, it begs the question of more research required to clarify the questions that it raises. But thank you for that first share. And we'll, as I say, ping me afterwards, and I'll put out with the notes when you're presenting at ICANN as well. So if anyone wants to dial into that on a different topic, they can hear more from you in Seattle or remotely. But thank you. Good presentation, really interesting.
Very much. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Right. Let me then reshare my slides. Okay, so I hope you all found that useful. As always, I'm just going to pick up on some of the sort of recent developments in the news over the last couple of weeks. And a reminder, if you don't get the weekly headlines email, so every Monday morning UK time, just ping me a message and I'll add you to the mailing list. As always, I'm not going to go through all these. I'll just call out a few of the more interesting ones. So Eurodig, those of you interested on the policy side, that's they've identified the main themes that will be form the basis for their meeting in mid-May in Strasbourg, which you can see are WSIS plus 20 recommendations, online privacy, European Digital and Cyber Strategy 2030, Europe versus tech giants, AI regulation and governance. So 5 fairly broad themes for that. And also that should say, sorry, a typo on the next one, the ICANN 82 schedule is here, given we're just talking about that. So if you click on that link, you can see the schedule for the meeting. You do need to be registered, I think, on ICANN for that to actually work though. So it may prompt you for your name and login before it throw up the schedule. At least that's what was happening on my machine. But the program details are now available. Just flipping over, as I say, I won't go through all of these. I came across something called DNS Tapir, the DNS Threat and Privacy Internet Research, which I hadn't seen before, which looked pretty interesting. And they've just secured some funding to do the next stage of their development. I think the intent is to source sort of data, treat it in a privacy preserving manner, and use it for analysis. But as I say, it's on threat and privacy internet research. So it looked like an interesting program. So I thought I would just highlight that because it's potentially something that may sort of resonate with some of you as well. Quite a good report for Philnet, a DNS filter on trends in cyber squatting, typo squatting, and other malicious domains. So just continuing the debate around abuse, this time DNS abuse. So it's good to see that from the DNS filter team, and also coincidentally from the DNS Research Federation. A report on bulk registrations. This is bulk, DNS registrations, both sort of legitimate uses of bulk registrations, but also those used for malicious purposes, which Alex Deacon has put together a report on that to try and build out, as it says on the slide, a sort of taxonomy of the sort of different types of bulk registration to help give consistency of phraseology to make it easier to have conversations about the topic. And then a few other things which there was nothing else I really sort of pulled out as a specific interest, but as you would have seen, quite a lot of stuff in the news this week. So plenty to read up on if you haven't already caught up on the headlines, and similarly a whole bunch of other stuff not at all DNS related, which also caught my eye, inevitably, including some stuff on AI, some interesting use cases on malware using virtual machines, on some analysis of ad tech and other stuff, and the one at the bottom for anyone that's a coder, Claude Code. So this is Anthropic have announced a improved AI sort of generative AI sort of coding capability. So there seems to be a clear direction of travel of incremental improvements in that space. So I thought that was worth highlighting. And then finally, the one just above that, you may have seen the announcement that Skype is being sunsetted later on this year. So if you're still a Skype user, I think you'll need to transition to presumably Teams, as that's withdrawn from service. In terms of deadlines, different things. One to mention, which I forgot to put in my email earlier today, if you're planning to go to the IETF 122 meeting in Bangkok next month, the early registration cut-off, including payment, is this evening, so 23:59 UTC today. After which the in-person registration goes up by, I think, just over $100, and I think about $50 or thereabouts for remote presentation for the week. So if you're planning to go, haven't registered yet, you can save $100 if you do that today rather than leave it till tomorrow. Also, if you're planning to submit a presentation proposal for the next RIPE meeting in Lisbon in May, again, the deadline for that's today. So if you haven't done it already, you'll need to do that quite quickly. And then sort of various other stuff coming up, not least of which on the 12th of March, that's the cut-off for session proposals for the next Internet Governance Forum meeting, remembering that that's been brought forward to the middle of this year rather than the end of the year to fit in with some other UN stuff around WSIS plus 20. So if you're planning to participate in IGF, you've got just over a week to put your initial submission in. And then, yeah, more deadlines coming up later in the year, which we won't worry about. It's all, this week is NWC in Barcelona, but chances are you're there and know that, if that's of interest to you. And then, as we mentioned, I think from next weekend you've got the ICANN meeting kicking off in Seattle. Then the DNS Hackathon and ITF 122 from the 5th, both of which are from the 15th of March in Stockholm and Bangkok, respectively. So plenty of stuff happening over the next few weeks. I should also mention, as it's not so far away, the RSA conference coming up in San Francisco at the end of April. In case anyone's planning to go there, I'll be in Bangkok and San Francisco. So if anyone's going in person to either of those, let me know. It'd be good to meet up in either or both of those. And then finally, we'll be talking about the ITF agenda next week. Hopefully most of the working group agendas should be published by then, so we'll talk through some of the sessions that look to be of particular interest. And then obviously the following week won't be a call because of the clash with the ITF meeting itself. So yeah, as I say, next week the main focus will be the ITF meeting, and I'll share the working groups that look like they're particularly worthwhile attending through the week. I think, yeah, that's pretty much it from me. So let me stop sharing. So, and just pause for a moment to see if anyone's got anything else, well, any questions on what we covered for that matter, or indeed anything else that you wanted to bring up. And if you have, follow Ed's fine example, raise your virtual hand or pop something in the chat, whichever's easier. But Ed, if you unmute, the floor is yours. You're still muted, Ed.
All right.
That's
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Right. On my side, anyway, the last slide, future calls, you have UTC as the time zone up there. You might want to clarify that to, yeah, just a housekeeping issue.
Yeah, fair point. Yeah, I think on the email I did flag the change, but yeah, good point. I'll do that on the slide as well. Thank you. Good spot. Shows that you're paying attention. I'm impressed. Anything from anyone else that you want to share this week? Not seeing any hands raised, and I don't see anything in the chat. In which case, well, I hope that was useful. I hope you enjoyed the presentation from Mark. Mark's had to drop off because he's got another diary commitment. So I'll see if I can get his slides and share those post-call with a link to the recording, etc., as well as details of the slot he's involved with at the ICANN session as well, to pick up on the question in the chat on that. So without further ado then, let's call it a day there. Have a fantastic week, everyone, and look forward to catching up with you next week to talk about all the fun things going on at the ITF meeting, ITF 122. So catch you all then. Have a good week in the meantime. See you.
Thank you.